So it's my pleasure to introduce a colleague, Abdullahi Alim. He is the head of Project 2030 at the International Chamber of Commerce, where he researches and models catastrophic risks and works with business, financial, and entrepreneurial systems to help avert potential crises. He's also the former director of the Davos Lab at the World Economic Forum and of the Africa and Middle East Global Shapers Community, which works and invested with development of global youth citizenry and leadership. It's a pleasure to introduce Abdullahi, who will introduce our other guests.
Thank you. Just quickly go on stage. Well, good morning to each of you who've joined us today for the Cambridge Disinformation Summit. My name is Abdullahi Alim, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Much of the conversation will be guided by the discussions by our esteemed panel, but I thought maybe I'd quickly introduce myself as well, so that you know a bit about me. I'm a big believer that to understand an idea, you have to understand its roots. You have to understand its origins. And I also think that holds for people as well. So to understand me and to hopefully connect a bit more with me as well before today's panel, I'll share a bit about myself as well. I was born in Somalia, and I identify very much as one of the children of the 1991 Civil War. I am a product of one of the worst prolonged periods of drought in the late 80s and early 90s that grappled East Africa. I'm also a product of a time when our state of my home country of Somalia came to fall. I'm one of those children, and I'm specifically one of those surviving children. I was very fortunate to be able to seek asylum in Australia, on the other end of the Indian Ocean. See, what was waiting for me and my family was a changing country, a changing Australia. An Australia that was becoming more open, more receptive, more welcoming to people like myself. And I would be very specific to say, to non-white immigrants. I was also moving to a changing Australia in the sense that there was also a backlash towards this movement. What I wasn't perhaps as familiar with in my state of Western Australia was that we were also coming to terms with organized groups, organized networks, some who found their home in mainstream media, some who found their home in mainstream politics, in think tanks, in hate groups, who all had a shared disdain for what they felt was, again, a changing Australia, an Australia that was becoming more multiracial, more multicultural. I share this to talk specifically about my anecdote, my experience of being on the receiving end of disinformation tactics. I went to a school that was largely Muslim majority. I went to a school that was largely first-generation refugees. I went to a school which was colored by the experiences of on a Monday morning coming to find a severed pig head in our schoolyard. The kind of school where you'd sometimes find a noose, almost as a threat, as a signal to the students attending that school. And I also went to a school which, I have to say, fortunately, as morbid as it sounds, where we were also met one day with a bomb, which fortunately detonated after school hours as well. The effects of what feel like distant conversations on cable news, on radio talkback, which marginalize and perpetuate the disadvantage of already oppressed groups, has lived effects. It looked a lot like myself and my classmates withdrawing as students. It looked a lot like parents taking a step back, because being overwhelmed already in a new context, but also now having to contend with these political realities is almost too much. Decades later, something changed, something shifted, and I'm talking specifically about the COVID period. We were now almost on the receiving end of that same disinformation tactics. We were now the beneficiaries of it. In fact, as much as these disinformation tactics that purported the vaccines as being the product of this global socialist cabal, this global socialist agenda, which was in many ways reflecting the angst of what I describe as weaponized whiteness, we were now on the receiving end of it. Many of my own friends, many of my own families reject the use of the vaccines, reject much of what is good for us as well, because we have become so conditioned to being distrustful, to becoming so much on the periphery of society, that we now take disinformation as part and parcel of our reality. I share that just to give you the timeline of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of disinformation to then becoming marginalized and then becoming an end consumer of new tactics of disinformation in today's world. It reinforces, it validates oppression of certain groups, and it perpetuates our disadvantage as well. That is why, for me, beyond my own kind of professional association, disinformation is an important topic to me. So I hope that gives you a bit of context as we go into today's session. And I want to quickly introduce my esteemed panel here joining us. We have Gabriella Stern, who is the Director of Communications at the World Health Organization. And to her left, we have Heidi Larson, who's a Professor of Anthropology, Risk, and Decision Science at the London Centre of Neglected Tropical Disease Research. And who's the Director of the Vaccine Confidence Project as well. Last but certainly not least, I also have Todd Helmus, who's a Senior Behavioural Scientist at the RAND Corporation as well. Please welcome our panelists. I'm going to quickly ask each of our panelists, and this will be a brief remark from each as to why this topic is particularly pertinent to them when we talk about the societal implications of disinformation. Heidi, if I may, I will start with you.
Intro. I'm Heidi Larson. I am not from the London Centre for Neglected Tropical Disease Research. I'm not sure where that is, but I'm at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Not that it sounds a whole lot different, but anyway. But I'm also with the University of Washington in Seattle, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, and we've moved some of our research group to University of Antwerp for our EU work, to stay in the EU, and also Hong Kong, we have a big AI group working there. I'm an anthropologist I've really been focusing on risk and decision science, but have always worked in health. Before coming to vaccines, I was mostly working on adolescent sexual health and then got very involved with the whole AIDS response because all we had then was behavior in the beginning. We didn't even have tests, we didn't have diagnostics, we didn't have, through that whole movement, looking at the behavioral aspects was crucial. And then I came to vaccines. I was with UNICEF for 11 years and WHO for a few years. And the person on staff to keep in check the political, social, cultural reasons why people didn't want the good things that UNICEF or WHO had to offer for various reasons. But most of that work and most of that time was pretty benign. It was much more in the category of the hesitation, lack of information, maybe some beliefs, religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, gender issues. But I've seen just increasingly, we never, I would say 10 years ago, we would have isolated outbreaks of misinformation. And I wrote a piece in Nature in 2018 that suggested that viral disinformation would be one of the biggest pandemic risks. Not expecting it to get as bad as it did. And so I left UNICEF because I was asked at the time to launch with the partners, launch Gavi, and over 5 years lead communication and strategy for introducing new vaccines around the world. And work with all our in-country. And it was during those 5 years, from 2000 to 2005, that I developed the nickname, the director of UNICEF's fire department, because I ended up putting out more fires than doing proactive engagement and communication strategies. And it was strikingly diverse reasons. It was political reasons, it was, enough already. We can't even afford the vaccines that you want. We want It was sometimes political, it was a range of, and then back at the headquarters office, I would get calls in the US saying, why is UNICEF giving only the measles rubella, the MR vaccine, and not MMR? Is Wakefield right? Do you know something we should know? I said, actually, if they could afford the MMR, they'd be taking it. So a global mix, and I just saw every year the swell of misinformation. It was too much to deal with in my day job, although Carol Bellamy, who I was working with, gave me a day a week to, I had a position at Harvard School of Public Health to try to focus on understanding a bit more and realize this was much bigger than a day a week, and decided to leave because the biggest question I got was, how big of an issue is it? It's fringe. It's not that serious. You're being too negative. And I realized the only way that there would get some traction and attention is to start to quantify it. Because I couldn't answer those questions. We didn't have a baseline. We didn't know if it got worse. And so I set up the Vaccine Confidence Project, which is now 13 years old. And we're increasingly calling ourselves the Confidence Project because more and more health interventions are coming and saying, where do we start? We're facing all this traction. So I don't want to take more time, but landed here now. COVID has expanded the nature of what we're working on, but I'm really happy to be here and thrilled. And thank you, Alan, for driving and convening this important forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. I'm Gabriella Stern. You can call me Gabby. I'm going to say a few things about myself that's relevant to what we're talking about today. I'm a citizen of the US and the UK. My parents, I'm a first-generation American. My parents came to America. They were refugees from Hitler. So what Professor Jolly said this morning really resonated. Propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, basically assaults on truth and on people have a lot of meaning for us personally, but for everyone in this room. That's one thing I want you to know about me. The other one is that I'm the mother of 2 adult kids, a wife, and the mommy of, or the grandma of a 16-year-old cat. Thirdly, I have been the director of communications at the World Health Organization for 4 years. I joined in 2019 during a very bad Ebola outbreak in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then came COVID. But most of my career, I was a journalist for approximately 35 years, and there are a couple former colleagues of mine in the room. So I have a perspective from being a reporter and an editor for many, many years, and now having been in health and science communications for several years. I run a department at the WHO headquarters in Geneva. We are a small but scrappy group of people. Some of them are former journalists like myself. Some are doctors or health workers who have gone into communications. Others are videographers, photographers, and various people. And I want to just quickly talk about WHO because we are a target of disinformation, and so as a result, people don't often understand what we are. We are an organization, we're the specialized health institution of the United Nations. We have 194 stakeholders. Those are the 194 governments that make up the UN. We are not very well funded. Our funding is not dissimilar from a decent-sized hospital system in the United States. And yet, we are across basically all communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, mental health, emergencies that are a result of an earthquake, let's say in Turkey or Syria, or a Marburg outbreak in Western Africa, or the Pakistan floods, and so on. So we have an incredibly rich portfolio and huge challenges and opportunities. And our Constitution has, which I recommend you reading sometime if you have a lot of time, but the beauty of the Constitution is that we believe that everyone, everywhere, has the right to the highest attainable level of health. And health is not just the absence of disease. Health is actually active, is life with well-being, physical and mental well-being. COVID was a massive body of work for the World Health Organization, and I'd be glad to talk about it during the Q&A with you, and of course up here. So more from me after I turn to Todd.
Hi, Todd Helmus. I work at RAND Corporation, where my work focuses largely on issues of national security. I cut my teeth a number of years ago doing counter Al-Qaeda radicalization and recruitment, and spent some time working on that topic with the U.S. military in Iraq and then Afghanistan for a while. And then I found myself at a crossroads because bin Laden had been killed. And I was worried about my career. But ISIS quickly came on the scene, and then soon, of course, news broke while I was studying Russian propaganda of Russians' intrusion in the 2016 election. And I see a lot of parallels to ISIS and Al-Qaeda radicalization, recruitment, and disinformation tactics, and the impact that they have societally and individually. So that's my background.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all. Gabriella, I may just start with you because it's I think, not lost on many of us that the WHO over the last few years was incredibly politicized, incredibly bastardized, if I may also add, and
incredibly what?
Bastardized as well as an organization. And it's an unfortunate reality that we will have to contend with future health crises of a global nature as well. But this is happening at the same time as there's an assault at the national level on global cooperation, on multilateralism. In fact, there are political movements that are now saying that that is a threat towards our own national sovereignty. The more we cede power towards these international organizations, these unknown sort of powerful bodies based in Europe and the United States. How do we rebuild solidarity, trust, so that we are in a better position should another pandemic come to bear, for example?
Something you said is really resonant, which is powerful organizations. I think that a lot of the disinformation, the lies that are told about my organization and individuals who are like me or others who are there, the purveyors of disinformation impute way more power to us than we have. We have no power to go into a country, to march in to China, let's say, in January 2020, or and seize samples from patients. We have no power to say to President Trump, please do not, or you must not tell your population to take bleach to deal with COVID. We cannot force the then Brazilian President Bolsonaro to stop peddling hydroxychloroquine, et cetera. We have, so part of the disinformation is to spin a narrative that bestows way more power and clout on a bunch of people, scientists, doctors, health workers, public health experts, communications people, who have the ability to recommend, to advise, to guide. We do nothing without colleagues from other institutions, universities, research labs, governments. In fact, in January 2020, when we got the signal that something was amiss in China, and we all worked on January 1, New Year's Day, And from then on, we're publishing papers and convening groups to figure out what is going on. We had 24 Americans from NIH, CDC, and so on in our building with us because they were embedded with us. WHO always has embeds from all our member states in our building in Geneva, in our 150 country offices, and so on. So we are a secretariat for the member states who created us 75 years ago. This is our 75th birthday. We were created in 1948. And they wrote the Constitution, and they believe that we exist to help them bring health to their populations. And of course, billions of people around the world have no access to the basic level of health that I hope most of us in this room have. And we saw during COVID, we were the people at WHO, we were the ones who in August 2020 started screaming about vaccine nationalism when the affluent countries were striking massive deals with the pharma and biotech companies. Hundreds of millions of doses being locked up months before the vaccines would even be available. Way more than they could possibly disseminate over a reasonable period of time once the vaccines became available. But even just to backtrack, in January 2020 and February 2020, we were shouting from the rooftop. Our DG, our Director General, Dr. Tedros, the first African Director General of WHO, was doing daily press conferences, which is quite, you name any agency or government where the head does daily press conferences warning presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, that the window of opportunity was closing to protect your people, to do contact tracing, testing, isolation, quarantine, do all the things now, activate your public health systems before it became pandemic. So we are basically a bunch of people doing our best. When we mess up, we announce that. We still have massive press conferences. And I just want to say one quick thing. I know I'm rambling a bit. Trust in institutions, trust in people. You know, I don't think anyone warrants automatic trust, right? It's not about trusting institutions or trusting people. It's about being able to understand that the institution you're dealing with or the people who represent the institution are going to be as transparent as possible about what they're doing. And when they make a mistake, they will let you know. And when they think you're making a mistake, they'll let you know. To me, trust is founded in a good faith dialogue with an institution or a person. I think that when we talk about, we have to build trust, WHO has to rebuild trust, we have to do it through a journey with people and being with them and bringing them along. Anyway, that's it from me.
No, fair point. And Heidi, it's a connected question. You mentioned the Vaccine Confidence Project. There's obviously a lot of resistance to the uptake of vaccines.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned before that it's almost rarely about the vaccine itself. It usually speaks to underlying social, political, economic angst of sorts. Could you speak to some of those root causes and maybe some of the disinformation tactics that support that?
Yeah, and I will distinguish a lot of the vaccine non-acceptance or delays are related more to what I call accidental misinformation, that it's plausible. It's plausible in the absence of a better story from public health or national health systems. So, but on your point really about the disinformation, which is our focus, I think what's driving, and I wrote a book called Stuck, How Vaccine Rumors Start and Why They Don't Go Away. And if there's one, the part that I feel like needs a part 2 is on the disinformation, because the book is much more about the first 10 years of what we learned and the stories and the, but it didn't really tackle the more extreme, and it was also an appeal to stop judging and start listening. But you need totally different strategies for the disinformation. But one place we can do something a bit more is to already work on this middle ground. But the root, because some of the causes are the same, and where it gets different, I think, in the disinformation is, as we heard this morning, the motive. It's all about the motive. That's the biggest difference that I can see, and some of the tactics. But the drivers that we're seeing, I mean, you mentioned bin Laden. Well, in Pakistan, for some reason that still baffles me, the US government decided to make the hunt for bin Laden. We're going to find his DNA by doing a fake door-to-door vaccination campaign and somehow get in the door to get a piece of hair or a sample to confirm we're targeting the right house. What were they thinking? I don't know. I mean, as one of my colleagues said, why not the milkman? Why the vaccinator? Especially at a fragile time in global polio eradication when, Pakistan is the country that we're in a fragile state. And one thing that really struck me was a number of us were saying, this is a problem. We've got to really tackle this one. This isn't about the vaccine. And UNICEF said, well, we've just done a survey with a lot of parents, and I think you're overhyping the risk here, and the parents really want the vaccine. I said, that's not the problem. You're asking the wrong people. This is affecting and fueling and amplifying the gatekeepers. The Taliban, the one, and by the way, there's multiple Taliban. There's not just one Taliban. And, you're making your deals with the good Taliban, but there's also the other ones that are causing the problem. So we need to, what it did was give credence to conspiracy. If 10 years earlier, when we had polio boycotts in northern Nigeria, and because of perceived rumors about sterilization, which actually weren't about sterilization, it was about the war on terror and the axis of evil, and the fact that coming out of in the context of the Iraq War, there was a Western war on Muslims. That was the geopolitical situation that was fueling and giving credence. Because for disinformation, you need, and I liked the 99% truth that gets you in the door, and then the 1% that, that's all it takes, that 1%, that one thing that you've got them, pulled them all along the way, and then, you give them the good cookie, and then you give the poison one at the end. But it's been a big issue. So if there's one thing I can say in terms of drivers, the drivers are not where you look for them most of the time. Certainly in the vaccine work, and we've increasingly gone beyond that, because at the end of the day, it's always about something else. There is a handful of people, and probably more in the hesitant area, that it's actually about the vaccine. It's about the relationships around the vaccine. And the things driving it are incidents and revenge. Revenge is driving disinformation because we're going to get them back. And how are we going to get them back? A number of the strategies and things we heard about this morning. Anti-government control. That's a huge driver. This pro-freedom mantra and anti-government control. Disinformation is trying to polarize. It's the motive we need to understand, because if we don't understand the motive, we're missing the point, which was the working title for my book, but my editor at Oxford, excuse me, not Cambridge Press, decided these days you need one word, because that's the attention span. And the other thing is financial gains. There's a lot of people making a lot of money, which I think Ellen outlined the incentives. There was some of the one of the early papers on this in the vaccine space was on weaponization. And really, when they went to the roots of where the online disinformation was coming from, it was equally embedding the pro-vaccine as well as the against vaccine, equal. So the same source was going not to try to amplify the negative voices, but to create hostility between the two. Look at how bad that guy is. Awful, awful. Why is he, and then the other side. So it was creating polarization. And I think a huge driver right now and disruptor, well beyond the vaccine space, and vaccines is actually, and the growth of the anti-vaccine networks, is a beautiful platform for disinformation, for politics, for finances, for whatever. It's become the go-to place because it's got the world's attention. And COVID helped that quite a bit because those evil global institutions are getting all of us now. But anyway, it's a platform, and it's not really about the vaccine most of the time.
Todd, I'll jump to you, and it's a question specifically on the relationship between social media and how extremist groups are now using it particularly towards tapping into and amplifying grievance politics. Especially all that we've seen over the last few years, have you seen the tactics evolve as such, and how does it look like now?
So I feel there's really two ingredients to an effective campaign like this. One is disseminating information, and the second is inspiring community. Just take a look. I think to think about tactics, it's helpful to think about Russia's evolution over these last few years. They started out with an AstroTurf campaign of basically pretending they were Americans and disseminating content, and they disseminated a lot of content, like 10,000 tweets, 1,000 YouTube pages, videos, 60,000 Facebook posts. So they disseminated a lot of content, and of course that content wasn't geared toward as much of their campaign to focus on division, to promote division with the United States. Promoting black separatism, helping to get conservatives to become more conservative, or to focus on heritage issues or gun rights or things like that. Whatever they could do to make an existing element more extreme. And they also used Facebook pages that, in theory could have been used to build community around those topics. And the community is really important, as I'll come to in a second. But the tactics-wise, they've evolved in these tactics, and this shows the variability of this, right? So fake news, working with existing troll farms that had their own audiences that they could tap into, fake news magazines, and of course the entire apparatus around Sputnik and RT to disseminate additional stories online that could be shared, and then of course using influencers. A terrible effort at it, but they did try to use influencers to undermine the Pfizer biotech vaccine. And so there's these tactics that you can use to disseminate content, but the other side is just this role of community. And if you look at how extremist groups operate, whether they're Al-Qaeda, whether they're ISIS, whether they're January 6th movement, community is really an inherent part of that process. So you can receive information, but the real value in propaganda is reinforcing adoption of that information, reinforcing people who share that information, embracing people as a reward for people who share and adopt those views. That's what you get on these Facebook groups that were really fundamental to inspiring January 6th. It wasn't just people by themselves hearing information. It was this community that was self-reinforcing. And we've known for a long time that the way Al-Qaeda and ISIS radicalize, nobody radicalizes by themselves. They always radicalize in communities. And so you see this same process. So when I think about fixes, yes, you need to stop the dissemination of the information, but you also need to address this need for community that people have. And for people who are in those communities, you need to provide them some adequate way out, some reinforcing way out so they have something to go to. There's an open arm to go to, and I think that's the fundamental policy challenge.
And sometimes it feels quite decentralized, some of this disinformation tactics, but I came across a particular statistic that said that about, I think it was 60% or a large bulk of COVID misinformation came from about 12 accounts on social media with a following of close to 60 million. Gabriella, what do you think is the role, let's say, of the social media companies? Because it can't just be WHO trying to counter misinformation on its own. In fact, I almost feel like that becomes almost a mandate of its own. What then becomes the responsibility of the social media tech giants in this particular space?
Social media, I would be interesting, raise your hands if you are on X, formerly known as Twitter. So we're all using social media. That's just one example. We're probably all on other ones. So social media is incredibly wonderful, and it's incredibly terrible. And the owners and shareholders of these companies need to maximize or optimize the wonderfulness and make sure that that their billions of followers and users are receiving information that will help them live better lives and enjoy physical and mental health. So they have an incredible opportunity and obligation to create these communities around health and peace and save the earth and all sorts of good things. And when I talk to the social media companies, which I do quite a bit, I tell them, when you're on your deathbed, do you not want to say that during my 10, 20 years at Facebook, Meta, Insta, LinkedIn, whatever, Google, you can say you saved millions of lives if you run different campaigns, create groups. So they have an obligation and an opportunity. And many people at the social media companies, these are big companies, there are wonderful people there. I work with a lot of the health policy folks, and they're really great. Yet at the same time, they do need to stamp out the lies that are killing people, and they need to do more and better. And for instance, when COVID hit, we had already been working with some of the companies on anti-vax stuff. They were doing okay. They really weren't that motivated. COVID seems to have galvanized them, and they started doing more during COVID to deal with threats against people, threats against our scientists, racist, pornographic slurs against our director general and women scientists in particular, and just lies. They did more to get rid of the pollution, but they could always have done more. And there were times when for instance, Meta would do more on one of their platforms, but less on the other. All of which is to say, they need to do better. They need to make more of a concerted, consistent effort. The one thing, I was talking with Raju Narasetti, who's somewhere in here last night, the one conundrum for me is WhatsApp. I don't know what can be done about WhatsApp, but Raju, you should share this article. But even WhatsApp, there are ways that Meta could really do more to make it a safer space. But at a minimum, they should be swamping their platforms with information that'll make the world a better place. They have that obligation and opportunity.
And maybe just a continuation. Sometimes, this is my own personal bias, I guess, but sometimes I feel like there's a lot of attention on social media companies and a little less so on traditional media and their role in sometimes propagating disinformation, cable news, talkback radio, newspapers, so on and so forth. Do you see examples that maybe we could spotlight of them doing it right? And where do you find that more often?
So, I was a journalist. I was with the Wall Street Journal in many places around the world for about 25 years. And before that, I was in Nebraska. Diane said she was from Nebraska with the Omaha World Herald. So my heart and my whole being, I think I really am fundamentally a journalist. But I've been in health and science communications for 7 years or so. And I've been really heartbroken by what I've seen. But more than that, I'm embarrassed because when I think back on my own career, I realize that I was committing many of the really unfortunate habits that journalists fall into every day, every minute of every day. Caricaturing, stenographic journalism, where you're basically repeating back what someone in power has said and you're feeding it back to your audience. He said, she said, moral equivalence, false equivalence journalism, where you're taking a known liar and juxtaposing it against the statement of someone who is using evidence for their own assertions. And when things are really dire, when you have the worst pandemic in a century, when you have democracies under threat, when you have a climate crisis, it's all the more reason why you as a journalist, as a reporter or an editor, need to infuse your coverage, your broadcast coverage, your text coverage, whatever, with nuance. And it may cost you a click. It may not. But you have to, media reporters have to be honest with their readers or viewers and say to them, in effect, I'm giving you an anecdote. I'm giving you a piece of data. I'm giving you a quote. Caveat emptor. This may mean something. It may not mean something. It could mean this. It could mean that. It could mean the other. I will continue reporting. I will come back to you. But instead, there's this instinct among journalists to say something definitive. This is what it means. And to also recycle the news stories have something called a nut graph. I don't know if this is a familiar term, but it's the part of the story, it might come after the first paragraph or second one, that says, I've given you these facts in the first paragraphs in the headline, here's what it means. And they recycle those again and again. They don't even go back and refresh them and check them over again. Now, I'm making a very broad brush assertion because to your question, there are wonderful reporters out there. They do a great job, but they are the ones who are self-critical, self-aware, who are not afraid of nuance and subtlety, who don't make false equivalences, who don't just recycle quotes from leaders because they're powerful and I must give them back to my readers or my audiences. I can give you examples. I think ProPublica is amazing. I think Science Magazine is amazing. Stat, The Economist, and Bellingcat is not a journalistic organization, but and somebody mentioned them earlier, they are amazing, and they do incredible research. And there are many, many other wonderful journalists. The BBC is excellent, and they do apologize. Anyway, there are many examples, but I think there are habits, instincts, reflexive behaviors that actually need to be corrected, and they can be if reporters just decide to be more nuanced.
Absolutely. Heidi, somewhat of a depressing question, but it's just the reality. There will always be national political leaders who spread disinformation as a means to sort of tapping into grievance politics. With that context, how and what is the responsibility of the healthcare worker, of the sector at large, towards inoculating the public, guiding them towards more trusted sources?
Well, I think we thought about this a lot during COVID because there were a number of national leaders who were pushing their publics off the cliff if they really followed them, from telling the public they'll turn into crocodiles taking mRNA, to drinking COVID organics, to stating your political preferences, wearing a mask, or drinking hydroxychloroquine, which people just heard chloride and took things out of the laundry room. I think you can't just inoculate the general public. This is a situation where you really need to go local. You need to go ground up, because for one thing, if you try to inoculate the wrong population, it can absolutely backfire on you. So you need to find out, do some stakeholder mapping and find out which communities kind of don't go with that program. What are they doing right? How can they become their own advocates and internally? And basically surround the leader with, there are going to be groups that are just so beholden to their leader. And it was interesting what you were talking about with one journalist wanting to state the facts, being affirmative about that. It's kindergarten compared to, in terms of strength of affirmation, the disinformation landscape, the kind of things that are so definitely emboldened, with zero evidence. It constantly strikes me, this is the way it is, in such strong terms that makes you think it's got to be a fact, not to say it was kindergarten, but you know what I mean. It was in a genuine sense trying to, but unfortunately not. So I really think the important thing is to go local. Sometimes you don't want things high profile. This was something we've dealt with polio. You don't want, as much as I respect all the investment and support to the polio program, there were times where I would say to the Gates Foundation, this is not the time to send Bill Gates to Pakistan, because he's just going to, even though it's totally well-intended, we need to be hyper-local right now. We need to be not totally under the radar, but there are times where you just have to lay low, work local, get different groups on board, and it's going to be with different strategies.
Absolutely. We're going to open up to Q&A shortly. We're just on our last couple of questions. This is more a question to the panel, but it's an answer perhaps more towards some of the younger talent in the room today, because there is an unprecedented assault on healthcare workers, on academics, on scientists who are tackling misinformation. It does begin to get into an area where it begins to impact people's own sort of like safety, and just due to the level of threats that can sometimes be posed to you. Given that reality, because it is a reality and it's a reality for some of us here, how do we encourage and create spaces for those young talents to still pursue this important work given the challenges, given the reality? Open to all of us. Todd, I'll start.
Oh, I guess I'm started off here. It's really interesting. Many of you know my colleague, Nina Jankowicz, and she really sort of tells the story about this, because she was nominated to play a fairly significant role addressing disinformation in the United States for the Department of Homeland Security, and a dystopianly named Information Governance Board. That didn't work out, and the firestorm led her to have to leave that, but that was not the end of the story for her, because she became the target of significant levels of online abuse and threats. It goes beyond just getting called up for Congress right now, as some of my colleagues in Washington, D.C. are, to justify why they're addressing disinformation. It becomes very personal, and it becomes very dangerous for some people. Nina's advice, I think, is helpful. It really boils to her fundamental thing is to build community with each other. I mean, we're all sort of in this game together here. And if we can't support each other through this, then there's really nobody that can. So, relying on, as we build our connections on social media, building support with each other to help manage that is helpful. And of course, learning the tools and tactics of the trade to prevent abuse and to report online abuse and to learn how to block people and all those tactics and techniques that you can use to work social media. So, and for my part, I work at RAND as a nonpartisan research center, and it's kind of hard to be nonpartisan in this world because it seems like a lot of disinformation has a partisan angle. But, I think trying to address it as much from a nonpartisan angle as possible, right? It's not just the Republicans doing this. It's not just conservatives doing this. It's a both sides game. It may be a little bit uneven right now, but I think the way you talk about it, the way you word it, and the way you phrase this and communicate it, I think is really important, especially because you don't want to turn off the audiences that are in really most critical need of hearing your message.
I interpreted your question to mean, are we discouraging the young people in the audience from doing the kinds of things we do or getting, yeah. So, and I agree with what you said, Todd, but I'm going to address the issue of, if you're thinking about going into global health, please do. And it is as challenging as my 4 years at the World Health Organization have been, and not just because of disinformation, but COVID, and there's so, I have a tough job, but I have the best job in communications in the world, because we get to communicate about your health, my health, mental health, physical health, and the inequities. So it almost doesn't matter what you do, if you're an engineering student, a business student, English major, whatever. There are massive opportunities for innovation and progress in global health. I mean, just something as fundamental as clean water. Hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people do not have access to clean water, and that makes them sick. Sexual and reproductive health, access to family planning, and so on, not universal and being unwound in many places, and much more. So I encourage you, if you're remotely interested in global health, and if you want to talk about joining WHO or even just participating in any of our civil society councils, my email address is sterng@who.int. Email me, and then nudge me if I don't get back to you. I just think this is the moment. This is the moment, and COVID taught us that, if COVID didn't teach us anything, it's got to be that health is an investment, it's not a cost. It's a right. And what we need is solidarity, and we need you to make it happen, because old-timers like me will be gone soon enough.
I heard the question maybe a little differently, but it's good we've heard it in different ways because we can bring different perspectives. We often, and we've heard it today a couple times, people still trust scientists and healthcare professionals. I think that's sort of true. It's mostly true in surveys, but there is a growing amount of wobbliness on the part of healthcare professionals themselves around vaccines, but other things. I mean, we had, I think, to the surprise of many people in the UK health system, Trafalgar Square during COVID, there was a huge demonstration from NHS workers. They covered Trafalgar Square with a beautiful quilt, reminded me of the AIDS quilt, of their scrubs, saying, we are not going to take this vaccine because you tell us to. It wasn't against the vaccine, again. It was about the fact that they were being told they had to come to work. To them, it was humiliating. It was not trusting them, it was insulting them, and not giving them a choice. They said, we're working 24-hour days. So it was about that tension. So I think there is anger, and sometimes, I mean, now in terms of aggression, I mean, there have been reports, even last week or the week before, about doctors being pushed against the wall and their hair being pulled in one of the UK hospitals. I've seen the same in Belgium and in other places. We've had some suicide patients literally killing doctors in some parts of China because they didn't trust their motive. In the switch from a communist setting to slowly integrate some individual pay systems, all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, are you telling me I have that because you make a few more dollars on it? Or I didn't like that diagnosis, I don't trust your motive. So it's not that straightforward. There is a general, I mean, the last lone soldier, because I think government, media, the usual, I mean, they all have dropped in the Edelman Trust Barometer. There is still trust. Actually, what was interesting is the trust has gone up in employers and businesses. Get us out of this mess that governments and others got us into. But I personally, and I'm sure there's some others in the room, have had a number of death threats, including last week. And it's nasty. And most of it is not online. It's been handwritten. It's been sent to the mail. It's been delivered to the reception desk. It's been phone calls. It's been other kinds of threats that are not online. And the thing about the whole disinformation space is the experts at it are much quicker, much more nimble, much smarter than certainly public health, and the financial sector might be a bit more on top of their game than public health. But they're so nimble, so quick. The minute there's a regulation, they'll either change their pathway or they change a statement to a question. Would you take this vaccine if you really knew what was in it? Billboards. There's a billboard campaign in about 6 countries that put these questions. Do you really know the risk? And what's happening is, and during COVID, the aggression against scientists and healthcare professionals has science, the journal, Nature and the journal have done global surveys against about aggression, and the number of physical, verbal, other assaults has really gone up. And I think, aside from younger people wanting to go into the profession, I think we've got a current issue of a number of us who are like, do I really want to do a public talk? I think I'd rather do that one online. It might be safer. Or some not wanting to talk at all, saying, I did those 5 media things, I've heard enough already. And part of the issue was that during COVID, I mean, I talk sometimes about the, enlightenment, and then I'll stop here. Enlightenment was science was free thinking. Science was freedom from religious dogma. The free universities were not under religion. And we've had a total flip. Right now, religion, belief systems are freedom from scientific dogma. Science says, therefore you do. That was COVID. And we have a lot of anger towards scientists, towards other health policymakers, because it's their fault I was locked up. It's their fault I couldn't go to school. And some of that aggression didn't come out as much during COVID, partly because of the restrictions, and is increasingly inside people. And we've got to figure this one out. And I think, one, peer support, is going to be important, which was mentioned, but I also think we need to get in the health and science side out of the box. We need our financial sector friends. We need our cross-disciplines, because the way we got ourselves out of a number of vaccine situations were going with getting out of that focus thing. We need to defocus what these disinformation networks are trying to hit. They're trying to hit you because you're with vaccine. But if tomorrow I'm in the finance world and the next day I'm over there, it's much harder to find where's Wally. I think we need to be a bit more clever with that.
Good point, good point. And on that note, we'll open the floor to Q&A. We've got one question. I know you had your hand up at the back. Okay.
We have some questions from the online audience.
Okay.
They're basically, does it work? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
They want to know your view. What is your answer to those who argue that fighting disinformation is a way of suppressing free speech? And in light of this, how can we prevent traditional media outlets to prevent spreading fake news and disinformation? Thank you.
Was that question directed to a particular?
No, I think to the whole panel.
Okay, so lightning round, because we're quite short. Or maybe
I hear two questions. One is, when is fighting disinformation suppression of the truth?
of free speech.
And then the other one is, how do we encourage media to not disseminate disinformation?
Which you sort of answered, actually, the second one.
I did answer the
Yeah,
second one,
so
yes.
maybe-
I think media can be much more nuanced and subtle and careful and so on. When is fighting disinformation suppression of the truth? Well, it depends on how you fight disinformation. If you are, in my department, we could spend, we get up every day and we have a staff meeting, a department meeting every day at 9:40 a.m. Don't ask why it's 9:40, but it's really so that our meeting is no longer than 20 minutes and we end at 10. Because if we start at 9:30, it'll be 30 minutes, and we don't want to spend that much time in a meeting. But we start our meeting by going through all the disinformation, misinformation stuff on social media, the stuff in media, and then we sit there and we go, what do we do? We could spend all our time fighting disinformation in various ways. Try to pre-bunk, try to debunk, try to contact fact checkers. And thank you, fact checkers. You do a wonderful job, truly. Or we could decide, let's invest today in proactively communicating about World Hepatitis Day. That's tomorrow. Drowning was the other day, and yesterday was Essential Medicines List. I mean, there's so much we could do. So actually, I'm trying to steer my department to focus more on proactive communication than in fretting and worrying about disinformation. That said, when there is egregious disinformation out there, you have to get out there with the facts, in the full knowledge that the facts will not necessarily influence the behavior, because people's minds it's a psychological thing, like Diane said. But I don't agree that fighting disinformation is any form of censorship. It's just saying this is wrong, you're being manipulated, or here are the facts, or here's how we see it, or here's a testimonial from a patient, or a physician, or a nurse. So I think that's how I view it.
Excellent. We had a question. Just by show of hands, how many questions do we have to sort of take? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay.
Hi, Rafi Mendelsohn, and I work for a threat intelligence company called Cyabra. Todd, you referenced briefly how in the US there are people being called to politicians questioning as to why are they fighting disinformation. There was an article in Nature earlier in the month about how disinformation researchers are now coming under attack. I've come under attack online. I know Alan has also been a target in organizing this, and it feels, it's kind of a evolution of what Heidi was saying. It feels like a step up as to where it was targeting scientists. Now it's also targeting those who are working on the front line of researching and fighting against disinformation. Is this something that you're seeing? How do you contextualize this? Is it something that's worrying you?
I'm not personally seeing it yet. But maybe that also deals with the fact that a lot of my work focuses on Russian propaganda. But I mean, I'm definitely seeing it in the United States. It's a partisan issue. I think in some ways it's sort of a natural progression of things because, you know, to the extent that disinformation is used to advance politics, then any attempt to call out that disinformation puts you into politics. Yeah, it's happening, and my guess is it's probably happening to women more than men, because women are subject to online abuse at far greater rates. I don't get trolled online when I send a controversial tweet. I just get ignored. Maybe is worse for me. But a lot of women get attacked, and so I think it's a lot trickier.
On this side, yes.
Thank you. My name is Eliani Abdurrahman. I'm from Harvard University. Gabi, when you spoke to us last fall, I had told you that I was thinking of resigning from Twitter's Trust and Safety Council. When Musk bought the platform in October, he's been going on about this council, but we've actually been there since 2016. In the end, 6 weeks later, I did resign. I tried to get as many of my council members, there were 100 of us, to resign along with me. It was 3 women who resigned. In retaliation, Elon Musk then instigated harassment against us on Twitter, and 4 days later, fired the rest of the council members. I'm saying this because I'm going back to your point, Abdullahi, about our reality and what we can do. And so the reason why I came here is because of Professor Alan Jungelizer. I really hope that this could be a place where it could be a community of practice, where we can support one another in the work that we do, because this is everyday harassment. I had to pivot my work, because my specialty is really on online child safety, to look at the taxonomy of online harassment. Because Elon Musk didn't say, go after Eliani. He did it in a very coded mass kind of language. And they did go after me. And so I really hope that it's not just a conference, that we can do something together after this summit. Thank you. It's just a comment.
Thank you. And a call to action as well. Thank you. There's a question.
There's a person here.
Yes.
Yeah, right in the front.
It's just here.
Yeah.
Get ready, get ready.
So, Ms. Stern, early on in the pandemic, the World Health Organization came out and said that SARS-CoV-2 was not airborne. And sadly, that, as we all know now, was misinformation. And then it took 2 years to say that it was airborne, even though SARS, the first SARS, was acknowledged back in 2003 as being airborne. How is it that that happened, that it took so long to get the correct information out? And how can we all regain trust in the World Health Organization after that was mishandled?
You can call me Gabby or Gabriella. Mrs. Stern is my mom. No, it's a very good question. And actually, one of the biggest lessons learned, I think, is there was a penchant or a tendency of scientists and public health experts early in the pandemic to say very definitive things. And to me, it's a sort of behavioral, psychological thing, which is you have a new pathogen that has emerged. You're trying to figure out what it is, what it isn't. And you feel an obligation to help people. And it's a bit like the journalists. I actually think there's a real analogy. When a journalist puts a sort of definitive headline, definitive nut graph, scientists and public health experts in the face of a crisis often will say, there's no evidence for this, or this is not the case, or this isn't. And that's, really problematic. And so basically what we need to do in the sector is communicate about evolution and explain that, especially when there's a new pathogen, that we have to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what it could be, here are the theories, here's what it means to you if you want to protect yourself and take the precautionary principle. And that is a huge lesson learned by my department, by my colleagues at WHO, but also I think in various CDCs and other institutions around, which is you don't need to be definitive when you don't have the information yet that would allow you to be definitive. So, yeah.
Thank you. One final question at the back.
So I'm Marianne Boisseau-Serra, so from Cambridge Business School, and I wanted to ask a question about the financial gains of anti-vaccine disinformation. So we have heard several times this morning that there are financial gains towards spreading disinformation on vaccine, but it isn't that straightforward to me, so could you please expand a bit more on that issue? Thank you.
Well, one example is there's a lot of money made in promoting alternatives to vaccines, for instance, but other health interventions. And people are making a lot of money on books, alternative products, videos. That's one thing. That's probably less extreme and aggressive than some of the disinformation. But others make gains by pushing, I mean, that's one of the biggest ones I've thought about it, but they also, as we've been talking about earlier today, it's not just about the disinformation itself, but the behaviors. And so what it does is can push you away from, say, buying one product and buying another. I mean, it sounds a bit too basic, but, or to push you towards another behavior that's going to have a knock-on effect on with a financial toll or a financial cost. I'm going to...
Can I broaden it beyond vaccines?
And advertising, that's
I mean, if you look at, I was speaking with someone, breastfeeding is a good thing. If you can breastfeed your children, you should, because it's magic, it's gold, it's liquid gold. Decades ago, the formula makers agreed to a marketing code of conduct around not discouraging breastfeeding when they're marketing formula, because some people need to use formula to feed their infants. But you see violations of the code all the time that implicitly or explicitly or overtly discourage women from breastfeeding. That is one example. Tobacco industry, other colleagues earlier today talked about the tobacco industry and the foot dragging that lasted for decades in acknowledging that it causes cancer, nicotine. There are just many examples where industry could do better. And I'm a big believer, maybe because I came from the financial journalism field, that we need to work with industry and incentivize them, pressure them, push them, partner with them to do better. Also with fatty foods, salty foods, sugary foods. Incidence of non-communicable diseases rising everywhere. Fastest in lower income countries, actually. Diabetes, hypertension, obesity, et cetera. So there's a massive opportunity. And I actually believe, and there's plenty of evidence, that companies can do good and make profits. It's not an either-or situation. It genuinely isn't. So.
Absolutely. On that note, we will have to close today's session, but just to remind you that each of us will be here for the remainder of the conference, and so the conversation does continue. And I want to also just reinforce the call to action that was made just earlier as well. This is supposed to be a community for us as well, a community of action really dedicated towards creating a space for those of us who are practitioners to continue our work, to amplify our work, to extend our work beyond our current remits as well. So I encourage all of us to be that kind of collaborative over the next couple of days as well. A big round of applause to our panelists once more. Thank you very much.